It is the 27th of August 1979. On a calm, sunny day off the coast of County Sligo in Ireland, a family embarks on a fishing trip. At first, all seems well, but then a massive explosion from an IRA bomb obliterates the boat and sends its passengers flying into the sea. Amongst the victims, including children who were pulled from the water, is an old man who, having sustained massive injuries, dies before reaching the shore. As the news of the attack reaches Britain, the shock is palpable and the nation goes into mourning, as the man was one of the most famous and high-ranking members of the royal family. His name? Lord Mountbatten, Earl Mountbatten of Burma. The man known to history as Lord Mountbatten was born on the 25th of June 1900 at Frogmore House, a 17th century manor of the Crown Estate at Windsor in Berkshire in England. At birth, he was given the names Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten. Louis's father was Prince Louis Alexander of Battenberg, a German principality of the Hessen region. The name Mountbatten is just an anglicization of the German Battenberg. Prince Louis Alexander was a member of the cadet or junior branch of the Royal House of Hessen and was the brother-in-law of Princess Beatrice, the daughter of Queen Victoria of Britain. Louis's mother was Princess Victoria. She was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria via her daughter Princess Alice. Thus, the future Lord Mountbatten was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, who had ruled Britain for so long, between 1837 and 1901, that the era became known as the Victorian Age. Mountbatten had 3 siblings, all older than he. Alice, born in 1885, would marry into the royal line of Denmark and Greece and was the mother of Prince Philip, who we will hear about again later. Another sister, Louise, born in 1889, became Queen Consort of Sweden in 1950. Finally, George would succeed their father as second Marquess of Milford Haven in later years. He was born in 1892. With nearly an 8-year gap between his birth and Louis', the future Lord Mountbatten was very much the baby of the family. Louis' childhood reflected his position as a scion of a cadet branch of several major European royal houses. He was raised in the vein of minor royalty. This began with his baptism by Philip Elliot, the Dean of Windsor, while Queen Victoria, by then an elderly woman in her 80s, was named as his godmother. Louis was christened wearing the original royal christening gown which had been sewn 60 years earlier for the christening of Queen Victoria's first child, the Princess Victoria, Louis' great-aunt. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was named as Mountbatten's godfather. Curiously enough, during his earliest years, Louis was known to his family members as Dickie. This is a version of Richard, but Richard was not one of Louis's given names at his baptism. The discrepancy seemingly arose because Louis's great-grandmother suggested calling him Nicky in reflection of one of his middle names, Nicholas. Instead, people began referring to him as Dickie. Louis was home-schooled during his earliest years. The family travelled a lot, spending extended vacations in Germany and in Russia from time to time. At age 10 in 1910, he was sent away to Lockers Park School in Hertfordshire, then to the Royal Naval College at Osborne in 1913 as he entered his teenage years. He was noted from a very young age as being industrious, intelligent, and hard-working. His family's associations with the sea were strengthened when his father was named as First Sea Lord of Britain in 1912 by King George V. In August 1914, in response to Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium and a cascade of declarations of war elsewhere across Europe from the final days of July onwards, Britain entered the First World War. Within less than 3 months, Louis's father was hounded from his position as the First Sea Lord on account of the family's German ancestry. At the Royal Naval College, Louis feigned a lack of concern when he heard of this, but in reality, it impacted on him deeply. Much of his naval career over the next decades was driven by a desire to prove his family's detractors wrong. Another result of this anti-German sentiment was that the family firmly adopted the Mountbatten name over the Battenberg one during the conflict. Louis was still far too young to be enlisted in any meaningful manner in the armed forces when the conflict broke out. Instead, in November 1914, he arrived to the Naval College at Dartmouth. There, he began to display some keen abilities as a seaman. He was never particularly athletic or physically accomplished, but he had a good mind for naval tactics. As a result, after he transferred over to the Royal Naval College at Keyham in Devonport, he emerged first out of a class of 72 other cadets in 1916. By that time, he was 16 and was considered old enough to play a small role in the war. Assigned to the Lion, a ship captained by Admiral David Beatty, he saw naval action against the Germans, though not of a particularly intense kind. Thereafter, he transferred to the Queen Elizabeth early in 1917. His commanding officers from this time expressed the view that the young man had considerable potential as a naval officer. Still, there were no real opportunities to distinguish himself. The First World War was an overwhelmingly terrestrial affair, and despite the costly naval race that the British and Germans had engaged in through the 1900s, neither side really employed their navies in any consequential way other than the Battle of Jutland in the summer of 1916. Louis did visit the Western Front in France, and he also became the first member of the extended British royal family to serve in a submarine in wartime, albeit briefly. While the war had afforded him few opportunities to see major conflict, it was clear by the time it came to an end with the armistice of November 1918 that Mountbatten had the makings of a decent naval officer in him. He was still quite young at the time, and in 1919 he began studying at Christ's College at Cambridge University. It was intended he would spend 2 years there while still attached to the Royal Navy, the idea being to expand the worldview of young officers. Louis studied English literature with a focus on English poets like the 17th century author of Paradise Lost, John Milton, and the more recent Romantic-era poet Lord Byron. While at Cambridge, his politics became controversial. He was elected to the Standing Committee of the Cambridge Union Society, a debating society at the university with a long tradition going back to 1815. At events held by the Union, Louis seemed to often come down in favour of the political views of the Labour Party. This is hardly anything peculiar in today's world, but in the early 20th century the Labour Party were considered to be dangerous radicals by the more conservative establishment in Britain, particularly so in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, when communist movements were threatening to take over Germany, Hungary, and other countries, while Britain was essentially fighting a proxy war against the nascent Soviet Union in Russia. Mountbatten's politics would change over time. In any event, the Labour Party would soon become a mainstream entity when Ramsay MacDonald led them into government for the first time in 1924. Louis's naval career continued in an ancillary capacity while he was at Cambridge. He was confirmed as a sub-lieutenant early in 1919, and in April that year he took part in the Peace River pageant. A year later he was posted to the HMS Renown, and it was in that capacity that he took up a proposal made by his cousin, the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII. Edward was about to set off on a tour of the British Empire, a duty which senior royals were required to undertake every few years at a time when Britain's empire had never been greater in size. The Renown was deployed to accompany the heir, and so from the spring of 1920 onwards, he headed for Australia, cutting short his studies at Cambridge in the process. Although theoretically a junior officer on the Renown, Louis had a number of unofficial roles on the journey, becoming something of a diarist for Prince Edward and generally having to deal with the mood swings of an individual who would go on to become one of the most controversial monarchs in modern history. Despite Edward's difficult nature, the cousins became firm friends, and when a larger royal tour of Asia was mooted, taking in India and Japan in late 1921 and early 1922, Mountbatten agreed to go along again. He did so aboard the HMS Repulse, a battleship he was assigned to in 1921. A notable feature of this latter tour of Asia was that it was while in India that Louis acquired a taste for polo, a traditional game of the British elite, which is sometimes described as like hockey, but on horseback. Mountbatten's tours of Australia and Asia with Prince Edward in the early 1920s were important in multiple ways. In addition to forming a closer bond with the heir to the throne, he also met his wife. Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley was the daughter of Wilfrid Ashley and Amalia Cassel. Her father was a leading member of the Tory or Conservative Party and would serve as the Secretary of Transport under Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin between 1924 and 1929. He was also a grandson of the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury and was himself given the title of First Baron Mount Temple. On her mother's side, the Cassel family were immensely wealthy, and by the time she met Louis in 1921, she had just inherited a minor fortune of £2.3 million and extensive lands in England and Ireland. These included the Broadlands estate in Romsey in Hampshire and Classiebawn Castle in Ireland. They would spend much of their time living at the Broadlands estate in England, while Classiebawn Castle would play an important part in Mountbatten's later life and the ending of it. After a brief courtship, the pair, who were just a year apart in age, married on the 18th of July 1922. It was a formidable union of a senior royal cousin and a woman descended from both senior British aristocrats and the moneyed class. The newlyweds honeymooned in the US, where they visited Niagara Falls and had a cameo in a Charlie Chaplin film, which was never released. They had 2 daughters, Patricia, born in 1924, and Pamela, born in 1929, though no son. Both Lord and Lady Mountbatten were serially unfaithful, and their marriage was tempestuous, though they respected and relied on each other to a very considerable degree at the same time. Louis continued his naval career after returning to Britain following his and Edwina's honeymoon. He was assigned to the HMS Revenge early in 1923 and began studying to specialize as a signalling officer, graduating top of the course in 1925. He then spent the second half of the 1920s serving in the Mediterranean and at home in Portsmouth. In these 2 spheres, he worked as a wireless officer and as a signalling officer, and was respected by all who served with him as being dedicated, industrious, and talented. There was no royal favoritism at work here. In the late 1920s, he was appointed to teach signalling courses at Portsmouth, and he is generally credited with having improved the standard of modern Navy signalling, the methods through which ships communicate with one another at sea, within the Royal Navy. At the same time, the public image which he acquired during these years was that of a playboy. He liked fast cars and had a penchant as well for speedboats. The British media's perception of him as someone who enjoyed the high life was possibly deepened by his ties to his cousin, the Prince of Wales, who, as the 1920s turned into the 1930s, was viewed as increasingly wayward on account of his refusal to marry and produce an heir, his fondness for parties, and then his eventual decision to form a relationship with an American woman, Wallis Simpson, who quite inconveniently was already married. Louis's fondness for polo also continued, and he wrote An Introduction to Polo, which was published in 1931 and has become a standard introduction to the sport. In 1934, Mountbatten was appointed to his first major command when he was placed in charge of the Daring, a battleship in the Mediterranean. He switched before long to the Wishart. In the years that followed, he played a substantial role in British naval affairs. His activities could range from important ones to strategically inconsequential. He was, for instance, a central figure in the widespread adoption of the Oerlikon gun autocannon that would be used extensively as an anti-aircraft gun at sea during the Second World War, as well as establishing the Royal Naval Film Corporation to make films available to British mariners at sea. Trouble was brewing at home in England around the same time. King George V's health was declining swiftly in 1935, and he eventually died on the 20th of January 1936. With his passing, Louis's friend Prince Edward ascended as King Edward VIII. His reign was short and controversial. Edward's relationship with Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee, was still underway, albeit details of it were not widely known when he became king at the start of the year. Matters changed in the autumn, and Edward eventually resolved that he would marry Simpson no matter the consequences. As it turned out, the consequences for marrying an American one who had been married twice previously and was still married to her second husband, even as she dated Edward, were that the new king had to abdicate in December 1936, less than 11 months after assuming the throne. His younger brother replaced him as King George VI. Mountbatten was personally upset at this course of events and had tried to avert it, even preparing a list of potential marriage partners amongst Protestant members of the British aristocracy at one point for Edward. He was unscathed by the controversy himself, and his other cousin, the new king, quickly appointed him as his naval aide-de-camp in February 1937. The first 2 years of George VI's reign were ones in which Mountbatten was contributing to plans to develop a new battleship, the HMS Kelly, which was built at Newcastle and named in honour of the recently deceased Admiral of the Fleet, Sir John Kelly. He took over as commander of the ship when it was completed in the summer of 1939. At the time, it was becoming apparent that ships like it would soon be called to serve in a major war for the first time in 2 decades. British and French efforts to stave off German aggression and avoid a new pan-European war had failed after the Nazi annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland in 1938, and in March 1939, the Germans had taken over control of the rest of Czechoslovakia and the city of Memel on the coast of the Baltic Sea. When they invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France responded with declarations of war on Germany. Mountbatten's record as commander of the Kelly during the first 2 years of the Second World War was mixed. On the one hand, the ship ran into repeated difficulties. It was mined and torpedoed and spent months in port being repaired. Mountbatten did earn plaudits, though, for one especially daring escapade in which the stricken ship had to be towed back to port with a 50-foot hole in its side after being torpedoed and facing almost constant German attack in the North Sea for 4 days. Mountbatten's calm leadership was lauded afterwards. This occurred in mid-May during the Battle of Norway and right around the time Winston Churchill was entering office as Britain's wartime leader. The timing was fortuitous. Churchill saw the potential in promoting Mountbatten and the value of having a royal cousin in a prominent naval posting, and his rise as a major commander was assured. After being crippled during the Battle of Norway, the Kelly was in port for several months undergoing repairs. It would not be ready for service again until December 1940. In the interim, Mountbatten was assigned the HMS Javelin to captain as the battle for Britain was underway. Naval operations were absolutely critical to ensuring that Britain remained supplied and able to withstand German efforts to force the island nation to surrender after France and the Low Countries had fallen quickly in May and June 1940. Once the Kelly was ready again for service, Mountbatten was dispatched to join the Mediterranean fleet primarily stationed out of the island of Malta, a critical base as much of the fighting in 1941 for the British would focus on North Africa. Mountbatten's run of bad luck continued here. Churchill decided to intervene to try and help Britain's only major European ally in the first half of 1941, Greece, when the Nazis launched an aerial campaign to land paratroopers onto the island of Crete, on the 20th of May. Several British warships, including the Kelly, were sent to intervene, though they were sitting ducks without adequate air cover. The Kelly was attacked mercilessly by German bombers and was lost along with half the crew on the 23rd of May, though it did manage to take down several German Stuka bombers in the process. Mountbatten only survived himself by swimming to safety. Despite the problems the ships he commanded had experienced, Mountbatten's men clearly did not blame him. Instead, they repeatedly applied to serve under him whenever he was assigned to a new ship. After he had returned to England following the Crete intervention and the sinking of the Kelly, Mountbatten became involved in efforts to exploit the propaganda value of the demise of his ship to the maximum degree possible. He was consulted by Noel Coward and a relatively young David Lean, who directed In Which We Serve, a film about the story of the Kelly starring Coward and John Mills that was released to much effect in 1942. A 19-year-old Richard Attenborough made a brief appearance in it. Mountbatten was long gone from England by the time the film's production was underway. In October 1941, he was given a fresh command. His ship, this time, was the small aircraft carrier, the Illustrious. It had been badly damaged while serving on convoy duty between Greece and Malta in January 1941, and when Mountbatten was appointed to take over the carrier, it was in port in the United States, being repaired. He was consequently in the US in the weeks prior to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and provided the US Navy admirals with much advice on the Axis powers and their capabilities at sea, at a time when many in Washington were coming to the conclusion that war with the Japanese and Germany was probably inevitable. Mountbatten impressed many of his American counterparts, and the trip there in the autumn of 1941 was important in his being appointed to senior command in the Asian theatre before long. When he returned to Britain late in 1941, it was as an interim successor to Sir Roger Keyes, the Director of Combined Operations. The position involved coordinating activities between the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, and the British Army. In April 1942, Louis was confirmed in the position and was given the rank of a Vice Admiral in the Navy, Lieutenant General in the Army, and Air Marshal in the RAF. It was a rapid ascent to the post of Chief of Combined Operations, and his status as a royal cousin who obtained the post in his early 40s drew resentment from some quarters. Mountbatten assumed the position of Chief of Combined Operations just as the face of the war was changing. Between the Battle of France and the evacuation of Dunkirk in the early summer of 1940 and the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Britain's approach had been one of survival while trying to make some modest advances in North Africa and, if possible, keep Greece and other allies in the Balkans alive against the Germans and Italians. US entry into the war and the stalling of the German advance in Russia in the winter of 1941 changed the complexion of the conflict, and Churchill directed Mountbatten to be more aggressive in 1942. Mountbatten's tenure of the position will always be associated with the Dieppe raid, an attempted amphibious assault on the port of Dieppe in Normandy in northern France, on the 19th of August 1942. Approximately 6,000 troops, mostly Canadians, were landed near Dieppe with extensive air support from the RAF and naval backing from the Royal Navy. 2/3 of those involved were killed, wounded or captured, and a battleship was lost, along with dozens of landing vessels and aircraft. It is usually viewed as a disastrous operation, and it was in some ways, but overly negative assessments of it often miss the point. The Dieppe raid was never intended to be successful. It was designed as a learning exercise to see how a modern army, navy and air force might attempt a large amphibious invasion of northern France from southern England. In this light, it was an intelligence-gathering mission in preparation for what eventually became the D-Day landings 2 years later. Elsewhere, many of the missions which Mountbatten initiated were unequivocal successes. The Saint-Nazaire raid was the most effective of them. British commandos on the 28th of March 1942 completely sabotaged the dry dock at the port of Saint-Nazaire in Brittany, depriving the Germans of the use of their foremost port in the Bay of Biscay. Mountbatten's time as the British Chief of Combined Operations in Europe lasted for over a year and a half. Beyond organising successful missions like Saint-Nazaire, he was widely credited for his organisational abilities, building up a strong core of units that were able to engage in important missions in the North Atlantic using thousands of ships and planes and a well-trained corps of 50,000 men under his direct control. This was where Mountbatten excelled as a military administrator. He had been a decent naval commander, though often an unlucky one, but his real talent lay in operational command. It was because of these characteristics that when he was sent to the First Quebec Conference in Canada in August 1943, the Allied leaders had a potential further promotion in mind. The Soviet Union was still mired in the more brutal phase of the conflict with the Nazis in Russia, and the Soviet Premier, Joseph Stalin, did not attend at Quebec, nor did the Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek. Instead, it was a gathering headlined by Churchill, US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. There they deliberated on who should be appointed as the Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, a position they had decided to establish to coordinate British efforts in India and Burma, aid to the Chinese nationalists, Australian and New Zealand activities in the East Indies, and American contributions to the war in the region. Churchill pushed for Mountbatten to be appointed, and he was given the new posting, though it was not a foregone conclusion. A handful of other candidates had been considered. When Mountbatten arrived to India in the autumn of 1943, he faced many difficulties. Bengal, the region around modern-day Bangladesh and northeastern India, was in the grip of a devastating famine that would kill about 3 million people in 1943 and 1944. His forces in India and Burma were also facing large disease outbreaks, particularly fresh recruits who had no resistance to malaria and other tropical diseases. The situation in China was intolerable. The Chinese nationalists were almost unimaginably corrupt. In the face of their country being overrun by a merciless enemy, their leaders were more interested in pilfering the financial and logistical aid being sent to them from the Western Allies. To compound matters, the American senior commander in the region, General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell, had a conflicting position as the chief American liaison to Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. He was annoyed at having been passed over for the position of Supreme Allied Commander and constantly clashed with Mountbatten. Finally, Mountbatten had to deal with reluctant allies in British India and elsewhere, many of whom perceived that British policy was geared more towards preserving its empire in Asia after the war than defeating the Japanese at all costs. They satirized the acronym of Mountbatten's command, the SEAC for Southeast Asia Command, saying it actually stood for Save England's Asiatic Colonies. In the face of these difficulties, Mountbatten did his best to bring in relief aid to Bengal and manage Indian expectations, but the corruption of the Chinese nationalists could never be solved, and in the end, Stilwell had to be recalled to the US in 1944 by Roosevelt after he and Mountbatten repeatedly clashed. Mountbatten had operational oversight of one of the most memorable battles in the China-India-Burma theatre of the war. This was the twin battle of Imphal and Kohima that took place in the spring and summer of 1944 as the Japanese tried to push into northeastern India through Burma with the ultimate goal of possibly seizing control of Kolkata. The Japanese war effort was experiencing major difficulties by then, but the British position was intolerable owing to disease outbreaks. Approximately 120 British soldiers were being forced from active service because of disease for every one that was actually being killed or wounded in combat. Mountbatten made major inroads in trying to enforce better standards of hygiene and healthcare to ensure that the British and their allies were fighting the Japanese rather than germs. He also played a direct role at Imphal, moving 2 divisions by air from Arakan to relieve the Allied forces at Imphal. Victory there and at Kohima was not numerically significant, but it had seen a few thousand British and Allied troops hold out against a much larger Japanese force for months, and were expertly exploited for propaganda purposes as a kind of British Thermopylae in Burma. After it, Mountbatten went on the offensive with Rangoon, in modern-day Myanmar being the major target. In this, he clashed to some degree with Churchill, who favoured a more ambitious strike against the island of Sumatra as a first step towards liberating Singapore. Owing to these operational disagreements and a range of factors, including the monsoon season, it would be early May 1945 before Rangoon was liberated. Rangoon was liberated just as the war in Europe was coming to an end. Consequently, additional resources would soon be coming Mountbatten's way. With these, he aimed to accomplish the feat which would be the supreme success of his command in Southeast Asia, the campaign by land and sea southwards along the Malay Peninsula, and the liberation of Singapore, the pivot point of Britain's naval empire in the Far East. As part of the planning process, he travelled to Europe to attend the Potsdam Conference outside Berlin in mid-July. There, he learned that he would quite possibly be deprived of his victory as the Americans had developed an atomic bomb and were preparing to deploy it against the Japanese to force them to surrender without a bloody amphibious campaign against the Japanese home islands. Mountbatten also displayed his occasional lack of political tact here when he struck up conversation with Joseph Stalin by noting that he had been related to the Russian imperial family as a means of gaining an invite to the post-war celebrations in Moscow. Stalin, whose Soviet regime had murdered the last Tsar of Russia and all of his family, responded, with some irony, that Mountbatten was talking about people who had ruled Russia a long time ago. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August, not long after the Potsdam Conference closed, Mountbatten's planned campaign against the Japanese in Malaysia, Operation Zipper, was scuppered. It was still launched, but with the Japanese having surrendered on the 2nd of September 1945, Allied troops in Penang and Singapore arrived simply to accept the handing over of the city and other sites to them by the local Japanese commanders. Mountbatten received the formal surrender at Singapore on the 12th of September. With the end of the Second World War, a flood of awards and honours were bestowed on Mountbatten. These included numerous British chivalric honours, such as being made a Knight Companion of the Order of the Garter and a Knight Commander of the Order of Bath, two of the three most important chivalric orders in Britain. He also received numerous honours specific to British India and the Empire. Most of the British combat medals and awards of the Second World War were granted to Mountbatten too, notably the India Star, the Burma Star, the Italy Star, the Atlantic Star, and the Africa Star. None of these were empty accolades. He had served on all of these fronts and nearly lost his life. Mountbatten was feted by other nations as well. The Americans awarded him both the Distinguished Service Medal and the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, while the French made him a member of the Legion of Honor and awarded him the War Cross. There were numerous other distinctions. Effectively, Mountbatten was a genuine naval hero. There had been many members of the extended royal family in decades and centuries gone by, like King William IV, whose careers at sea had been lauded in an entirely exaggerated manner. But Mountbatten had earned his accolades. All of this was reflected in his aristocratic pedigree. Although he had been known as Lord Louis Mountbatten since the family changed its name from Battenberg to Mountbatten during the First World War, it was immediately after the Second World War that he acquired his more senior aristocratic titles. In 1946, he was made a Viscount, and the following year, he was named as First Earl Mountbatten of Burma. The concluding of the Second World War did not bring an end to Mountbatten's responsibilities as Supreme Commander of the Southeast Asia Command. In many ways, it had simply expanded his remit. He now had operational oversight of a liberated Singapore and Malaysia, while the collapse of Japanese rule meant that Indochina and the East Indies also fell under his initial control, although these were regions of French and Dutch colonial control prior to the war. In each region, the end of the war against the Japanese was quickly giving way to clashes with anti-colonial independence movements determined that there would be no return to the pre-war colonial situation. Some of these clashes would last in one form or another for the next 30 years. While Mountbatten's role here was simply to try and hand over control of Indochina and the East Indies to the French and Dutch in as controlled a manner as possible, he had other concerns besides. There were in the region of 750,000 Japanese soldiers in the territories that had surrendered to him, and these had to now be demobilized in as peaceful a fashion as possible. Interspersed with them were war criminals who needed to be identified. There were also food shortages and basic issues of law and order throughout Burma and Malaysia, as well as rising communist movements emboldened by the Soviet Union as the Second World War gave way to the Cold War. Mountbatten had his hands very full throughout the final months of 1945 and into 1946. The position as head of the Southeast Asia Command would not be the only major one that Mountbatten held in Asia. While he was managing the transition to peacetime conditions in Burma, Malaysia, Indochina and the East Indies, political events in India were taking on a life of their own that the British could no longer fully control. There had been a strong Indian independence movement for decades, buoyed by the example of other parts of the British Empire, like Canada, South Africa and Australia, that had gradually transitioned from being crown colonies to dependencies, and then largely to independent nations, albeit with their foreign policies still closely connected to that of Britain and the monarchy retained as the heads of state. However, the British government was markedly reluctant to engage in the same process of decolonisation in India. The British Raj was simply too valuable to Britain, and the situation there was different in other ways. Frustration had mounted in the 1930s as Indian independence leaders like Mahatma Gandhi engaged in increasingly truculent forms of peaceful resistance to the British. The outbreak of the war gave them the opportunity to demand that there would be concessions after the war. Reluctance to engage in talks then led to the Quit India movement, and once the war ended, it became clear that the Indian nationalists were no longer going to take no for an answer. Realizing that the fight was lost, the Labour government in Britain reluctantly agreed to the Indian Independence Act, which received the royal assent on the 18th of July 1947. While it was clear by the spring of 1947 that the British Raj was coming to an end, Britain had many interests in the subcontinent that needed to be preserved and managed. To this end, Mountbatten was appointed as the final British Viceroy and Governor-General of India in February 1947. He was granted extensive powers, greater than many recent viceroys, something that was attributable to his status as a royal cousin, the quasi-emergency situation which prevailed in India upon his appointment, and the esteem he was held in after the war. His primary charge when he arrived was to negotiate between all parties to determine what kind of independence was to be granted. The Raj was an enormous entity, a subcontinent with a huge population and many different regional cultures and ethnic groups. It had never been fully united under a single ruler or state prior to British rule, and it was quite possible that many regional groups would want a federal state in which considerable powers were devolved to places like Bengal, Gujarat, the Deccan, and the like. Most pressingly, there was an enormous religious divide. The Raj constituted modern-day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, the latter two of which are Muslim nations, while India is a Hindu country. In 1947, attention was focused on the issue of what arrangement should be reached to placate both groups and avoid violent conflict. Mountbatten quickly concluded that intercommunal tension between Muslims and Hindus was spiraling out of control, and that the situation could get very violent very quickly if independence weren't resolved quickly and a separate Muslim state created. To that end, he worked with all parties to forge Pakistan as a separate entity, which, at this initial juncture, included Bangladesh as a non-contiguous state. Once independence was implemented, Mountbatten remained in place to manage it with the Indian and Pakistani leaders. His remit as Viceroy expired, but he would remain as Governor-General of India for nearly another year. The situation turned chaotic immediately. A drive began to push Muslims out of newly formed India, particularly in the Punjab frontier region, and to remove Hindus from Pakistan. Tens of millions of people were uprooted, and by some estimates, 1 million or so people lost their lives in the violence, communal rioting, and instability. Mountbatten was a good choice to have as Governor-General at this juncture. He treated the situation as a military campaign in which order had to be established. In the midst of this, he sent off messages in which he claimed that the unrest he was seeing made the management of the war in Southeast Asia look like a rather simple affair. Eventually, law and order was imposed in the major cities, and the rioting and violence calmed down. It was replaced by clashes between the new Indian and Pakistani governments over the Vale of Kashmir, a conflict which has never been resolved. For his part, Mountbatten tried to remain impartial and worked with Gandhi, whom he admired, to that effect before he was assassinated in New Delhi on the 30th of January 1948. His efforts to be fair to both sides included demanding that the Indian government release very extensive financial assets which were owing to the Pakistani government, while helping to recruit and train Indian soldiers when Pakistan began attacking the Indian border. By the summer of 1948, independence and partition had occurred. They had been far from peaceful and bloodless, yet they had been managed in as effective a manner as Mountbatten felt he could achieve. Some argued that he had allowed independence to occur too quickly in the summer of 1947, and that if he had convinced the relevant parties to delay for another year or two, the violence could have been minimized, if not avoided. Mountbatten fired back that if independence had been delayed any further, the violence would have been even worse. The judgment of the Indian people was that he had done a good job. When he and Edwina prepared to leave India in June 1948, vast crowds turned out to send them on their way. Fewer British officials were as popular in India as the one who served as its final viceroy. Back in England, the political situation was changing too. In the midst of the unrest in India, Louis, had managed to make it briefly back to England to celebrate the marriage of his second cousin once removed, Elizabeth, the daughter and heir of King George VI, and his nephew, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, son of Mountbatten's sister Alice. It was on this occasion that Louis was made first Earl Mountbatten. Now, when he returned to England, it was to witness a gradual handing over of royal duties to his niece-in-law. King George VI, though still a relatively young man just entering his mid-50s, was suffering from a range of illnesses, including lung cancer. He died on the 6th of February 1952 at 56 years of age, bringing Mountbatten's niece-in-law to the throne as Queen Elizabeth II, and enabling the ascent of his nephew Philip to the position of royal consort. Lord Mountbatten was the ultimate royal insider and forged close relationships with several members of the British royal family, most notably his nephew, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the future King Charles. Known affectionately as Uncle Dickie, he was regarded as someone to whom they could turn for advice, even the late Queen. After his mother was institutionalized, Prince Philip lived with the Mountbattens, and he regarded his uncle more as a father figure. Likewise, Charles felt that Louis Mountbatten had time for him, while his parents remained distant due to the formality of royal life. They spent much time together on polo weekends and shooting grouse at Balmoral in Scotland and pheasants on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. He has said to have regarded the Mountbatten's Broadlands estate as a second home. Equally, Louis Mountbatten reportedly enjoyed the role of advising the man who would, one day, be king. He did, however, gain a reputation as a manipulator and a bully, famously advising Charles to sow his wild oats while he could, and at one time attempting to matchmake Charles with his granddaughter Amanda Knatchbull. Charles was devastated by Mountbatten's assassination, and, in a speech in 2015, as he visited the site of his death in Ireland, Charles spoke of the anguish of such a deep loss since, for him, Lord Mountbatten represented the grandfather he never had. As a mark of respect, Charles added the name Louis to his son William's names, an act echoed by William, who named his youngest son Prince Louis of Wales. Mountbatten later became a mentor to Prince Charles. Not long before Elizabeth became queen, Mountbatten had become involved in a rare controversy. It concerned Iran, which in those days was still ruled by the Pahlavi dynasty of the Shahs. Iran had never been fully conquered and colonized, making it a rare exception amongst African and Asian nations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. However, with the British Raj lying so nearby to the east, the British had inevitably become involved in Persian affairs to some extent, dueling with Russia as part of the Great Game in Central Asia in the 19th century. This had led to British entanglement in the Iranian economy, particularly so from 1908, when oil was discovered here, just as the Royal Navy was beginning to transition from coal-fired to oil-fired engines on board her ships. It was with consternation that the British government received news in 1951 that the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was being nationalized by the Shah. This was deemed a violation of an agreement reached in 1933 and the British took the Iranians to the International Court of Justice. Mountbatten intervened at this juncture, claiming that the new British Foreign Secretary, Herbert Morrison, should accept the Iranian decision. Resisting, he argued, was nothing more than a formerly great colonial power attempting to continue to exercise influence in countries that were no longer willing to accept it. This mirrored Mountbatten's wider colonial outlook in the aftermath of the Second World War. In an age of decolonization, he believed it was best to work with local elites. Trying to oppose them was doomed to failure. It was a pragmatic approach, one which the British government soon adopted as it began to grant independence to a slew of nations across Africa in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Following his time in India and his return to Europe, Mountbatten was free to return to his naval career after a lengthy hiatus. Doing so did involve a demotion from the heights of being in charge of military operations in Southeast Asia and then as Viceroy of a subcontinent. He took command of a cruiser squadron in the Mediterranean, originally with the rank of Rear Admiral, though he was promoted quickly enough to Vice Admiral in 1949 and then to the post of 4th Sea Lord in 1950. 2 years later came the appointment as head of the Mediterranean Fleet, a posting which also made him head of NATO's operations in the Mediterranean a few months later. Based out of Malta, which remained a Crown colony until 1964, Mountbatten had operational control over the British NATO forces in the region, which included French, Greek, and Turkish detachments, though the American Sixth Fleet remained outside of his jurisdiction, something which necessarily rendered his NATO command somewhat ceremonial, as the Sixth Fleet was the single most important naval division in the region next to the Mediterranean Fleet of the Royal Navy. Finally, in 1955, Mountbatten was promoted to the post of First Sea Lord and Chief of the Naval Staff, a posting that made him the de facto operational commander of the British Royal Navy. He became an Admiral of the Fleet the next year. All of this had to be viewed on merit. While he was a royal cousin, no British government would appoint an individual to head up the Royal Navy based on nepotism alone. Optically, it looked good that a British royal had attained to such a position, but Mountbatten had done so on the back of a very long and successful naval and administrative career. There were controversies, notably the Dieppe raid during the war, and the management of Indian independence and partition as Viceroy of India after it, yet in the main Mountbatten had proved up to any task apportioned to him. A year after his appointment as First Sea Lord, Mountbatten found himself at the centre of one of the foremost incidents involving the Royal Navy since the Second World War. On the 26th of July 1956, the President of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, announced that he was nationalising the Suez Canal Company. Egypt had never been fully colonised by the British. Instead, back in 1882, a protectorate of sorts had been established so that the British could ensure the security of its interest in the Suez Canal. This continued into the 20th century, and it was only after the Second World War that the British effectively ended their rule in Cairo. Still, like the US in Panama, Even when they stopped ruling the country, they continued to hold influence over the canal. Nasser's actions in the summer of 1956 signalled an abrupt end to British influence over the artificial waterway too. Mountbatten was immediately asked to prepare plans for deploying the Mediterranean fleet to Egypt to take back control of the canal. He drew up these plans, although at the same time he made it clear that he considered that the course the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, was embarking on was the incorrect one. Eden, Mountbatten suggested, needed to take greater cognizance of the political dynamics in the broader Middle East. The Americans were of the same view and refused to support the British, French and Israelis when they tried to secure the canal zone. In the course of the Suez Crisis, Mountbatten offered his resignation, though it was refused. Ultimately, the debacle was an embarrassment for Britain and accelerated the collapse of the empire in the years that followed. Despite being peripherally implicated in the Suez disaster, though in no way responsible for what was a political rather than a military failing, Mountbatten was promoted again in 1959, this time to become Chief of Defence Staff. This was a relatively new position in the British military setup. Effectively, it made Mountbatten a chairman of sorts over the other operational leaders. His work here into the 1960s was primarily bureaucratic. Mountbatten wanted to create a more unitary military establishment in Britain, one in which the Army, the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force were more unified and had a more cohesive system of ranks and promotions. He even proposed that the Admiralty, the War Office and the Air Ministry could be conceivably abolished and united under the Ministry of Defence, a move which indicates how reduced Britain's military capacities and obligations were by the 1960s from what they had been at the height of empire. In the mid-1960s, he also played a role in convincing successive governments, whether Labour or Tory-led, that there was a need for a strong nuclear deterrent. The Russians, he stated, had to know that Britain could offer effective resistance to Soviet expansion and aggression in Europe, independent of the United States. Mountbatten and others of his generation had lived through decades in which the Americans had been extremely isolationist and reluctant to involve themselves in Europe's affairs. They might well become aloof from the continent again at some point in the future, and who could have foreseen in the 1960s that the Cold War would be over in just over a quarter of a century? Mountbatten stepped down from his post as Chief of the Defence Staff in 1965. He had been offered the post of Governor of Rhodesia in what is now Zimbabwe shortly before this. He declined the offer, citing his being a tired widower in his 60s who didn't have the energy for such a posting. Edwina had died in 1960. Louis's decision was probably the correct one. Rhodesia was about to descend into violence as the white minority government of Ian Smith tried to establish its own form of apartheid, a move which led to the particularly nasty Bush War in which the Rhodesian government employed biological and chemical weapons against native rebel groups. Though theoretically retired from 1965, Mountbatten continued to be active. He was involved with nearly 180 different charities and organizations. Even though the time commitment each required was generally quite small, collectively they imposed quite a lot on his time. He was also occasionally asked to engage in one job or another, such as overseeing a committee that looked into prison reform in Britain, while he also held the largely ceremonial role of Governor of the Isle of Wight from 1965 until the position was abolished in 1974. Much attention has been garnered by claims that Mountbatten was involved in plots against the government of Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who was facing a series of crises in 1968 and again in the 1970s as high inflation and low growth, stagflation as it is now known, plagued Britain. The evidence suggests that there were plans for bringing down Wilson's government afoot, led by figures like the press baron Cecil King, owner of the Daily Mirror and other newspapers, but that Mountbatten was actually a figure who advised strongly against such efforts when he was contacted about it. In his later years, Mountbatten holidayed regularly in Ireland at the Classy-born Castle estate in County Sligo. This had been built by the 3rd Viscount Palmerston back in the mid-19th century during British colonial rule in Ireland. Mountbatten's wife, Edwina, had inherited it in 1939, and Mountbatten developed the habit of holidaying here most summers following her death in 1960. The castle lies on the Mullamore Peninsula in Sligo, a county which lies on the northwest coast of Ireland, only about 30 kilometres from the border between the Republic of Ireland, inside which Classy-born is located, and Northern Ireland. Mountbatten's time here in the 1960s and 1970s has become a subject of intense controversy in recent years. Claims have been made that Mountbatten was involved in events surrounding Kingmaker Boys' Home, an orphanage in Belfast where abuses were committed in the 1960s and 1970s. These claims were compounded by further allegations of inappropriate conduct by Mountbatten while he was serving in various other regions. The U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation had a file on Mountbatten in the 1940s that included allegations that he used to visit brothels in the Mediterranean both before and after the war, and that his public image was at variance with his private conduct. On the other side of the coin, there are many individuals who served with Mountbatten during the war and in the Mediterranean in the 1950s who have stated unequivocally that the claims are without basis. Similarly, an investigation conducted by the historical institution Abuse Inquiry in Northern Ireland dismissed the claims that had been made against Mountbatten in 2021. Ireland would prove not just controversial for Mountbatten, it was also fatal in the end. When he began holidaying there in the 1960s, the political situation just across the border in Northern Ireland was becoming quite tense. The country had been partitioned back in 1922 as a part of the Irish Revolution, so that the northern counties, where there was a Protestant majority, could remain a part of Britain. A system developed thereafter in which Irish Roman Catholics in Northern Ireland were severely discriminated against on the basis of ethnic background and religion. The situation was allowed to go on largely unchecked until the 1960s, when tensions finally began to escalate and violent opposition to the Protestant authorities ensued. By the late 1960s, the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, was engaging in terrorist attacks on both sides of the border, and they eventually moved their operations to England itself. The goal was to pressure the British government into either granting concessions to Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland or, in the long run, to exit Ireland altogether and allow for a unified Ireland controlled from Dublin. Holidaying regularly in the Irish countryside not far from the border with Northern Ireland, Mountbatten was something of a soft target. In the summer of 1979, the Provisional IRA planted a 50-pound bomb made from gelignite on board Mountbatten's fishing boat that he used regularly to fish off the Mullamore Peninsula. It was detonated while Mountbatten and several others were heading out to collect some lobster pots on the 27th of August 1979. Mountbatten survived the initial blast but died shortly afterwards, while 3 others, Mountbatten's grandson Nicholas, who was just 14, a local boy, Paul Maxwell, who was helping out on the ship, and Mountbatten's daughter Patricia's mother-in-law Doreen, were all killed as well, while his daughter Patricia and her husband were badly injured, though they survived. Mountbatten's assassination at 79 years of age caused shockwaves in Britain. Questions were inevitably asked about the security procedures that had been in place for the Mountbattens and why he had continued to holiday there as the crisis grew in Northern Ireland. It was revealed that Mountbatten had been advised to stop holidaying in Ireland altogether on several occasions, but had ignored such requests as he believed that doing so would be handing a victory of sorts to the IRA. Investigations also quickly led to the identification of Thomas McMahon as a potential suspect for having laid the bomb. He was arrested and traces of nitroglycerine were found on his clothes. He was convicted of the murders in November 1979 and sentenced to life in prison, though McMahon was later given early release in 1998. Mountbatten's funeral, which he had already made arrangements for as early as 1970, was held at Westminster Abbey. He was later laid to rest at Romsey Abbey in Hampshire. Ever the organiser, he had left details of what lunch was to be prepared for the mourners. In India, a week of mourning was declared. The Irish-American community that generally supported reform of the political situation in Northern Ireland were disturbed by the assassination of an individual who was considered a war hero in American circles. Louis Lord Mountbatten was one of the most distinguished individuals in the history of 20th century Britain, though his life and career were not always without controversy. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria and a cousin of the monarchs of Britain that ruled during his lifetime. Later, his ties to the royal family were cemented further when his nephew, Prince Philip, married the future Queen Elizabeth II. Like so many other British royals stretching back to the 18th century, a decision was taken early on in his life that Louis would be sent to join the Royal Navy and hopefully emerge as a credible officer. Unlike many predecessors, such as King William IV, Louis proved himself to be a talented naval officer. His ships ran into a succession of unfortunate attacks in the opening stages of the Second World War, but he managed these well enough that he was viewed as a heroic commander coming out of the end of the destruction of the Kelly in 1941. From there, a rapid ascent began as he was established as Chief of Combined Operations and developed a reputation as an accomplished naval administrator and organizer. This eventually led to his promotion to become the head of the Southeast Asian Command in the final 2 years of the war. There were some controversies, not least the sheer loss of life during the Dieppe raid, but that operation was never meant to be a success. The idea was to learn lessons from what was always going to be a failed initiative. Conversely, operations like the Saint-Nazaire raid and the Battle of Imphal were resounding successes. A war hero at the end of the Second World War, he was appointed as Viceroy of India, the last British official to serve in that office. He had been criticised by some since the late 1940s for allowing independence and partition to happen too quickly in 1947 and 1948, and thus creating the conditions for the violence and chaos which ensued, but it is not credible to suggest that any viceroy could have stopped intercommunal tensions between Hindus and Muslims from boiling over in 1947. Much of Mountbatten's career thereafter was something of an anticlimax. Still, the manner of his assassination in Ireland ensured that many decades after the peak of his career in the Second World War, Mountbatten was still generating headlines around the world. What do you think of Lord Mountbatten? Was he one of the great naval commanders and administrators of 20th century Britain, or was his legacy tainted by numerous issues, not least the Dieppe raid and the violence which occurred in India as independence and partition occurred during his time as Viceroy? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.